So for Unit 2, it is called triangle congruence. We are going to be learning how to write mathematical proofs to prove that two triangles are congruent in this unit. So what is a proof? A proof is a logical argument that shows a statement is true. So we have to use our knowledge of definitions, theorems, and other properties in order to show that a statement is true. We're going to be doing this using a two-column proof. All right, so we'll see that as we move forward. Essentially, you're going to have a T with the statement on one side and the reason on the other. When we write proofs, the first thing you're always going to do is write the given information first. That is the statement that tells you a little bit about the scenario. The last statement should be the proof statement. So you're going to end similar to like how you end a paragraph with a closing statement. This is your closing statement because this is your end goal. So these are some of the reasons that you can be using. So on your right side of the column, these are some of the reasons. We're going to be using a lot of definitions, so it's important that you review the glossary at the beginning of this packet to make sure that you understand a lot of the important definitions. We're going to go over a few right now. So if we look at the first one, this is an example of a format of a two-column proof right here. So if you are given that E is the midpoint, so right here is the midpoint of this segment. So a midpoint cuts a segment into two congruent halves. Therefore, you know that AE is congruent to EB. When you write this as a proof, you start with the given, and then you say, because of this, I know that these two are congruent. The reason, a midpoint divides a segment in half. This is the definition of a midpoint. Similarly, we are given that CD is perpendicular to AB. You must know the definition of perpendicular. A perpendicular line forms right angles. Because of this, angle AEC is a right angle, as is angle BEC. So again, you're simply taking that statement and splitting it up into a two-column format. You are given this information, that CD is perpendicular to AB. Because of this, just like we said, we know that there are two right angles. Why? Because of the definition of perpendicular lines. Another important vocabulary is bisect. To bisect is to cut something into two congruent pieces, right? You're splitting it essentially in half. Therefore, if CD bisects AB at E, so right here is where there's the cut, you know that AE is congruent to EB. Same format, start with the given information, write your conclusion, and then your reason. Again, we're using the definition of a bisector to give our reason for why AE is congruent to EB. And then finally, altitude. So what's important here is that with the altitude, if you look right here, this line that's dropped down, it is a side in both triangle 1 and triangle 2. So if you were to draw the two triangles separately, you could say that BD is congruent to BD. It seems a little silly to say that, but it's really important when you're trying to prove that 1 is congruent to 2, because that's a very easy side to say, hey, look, this side is the same in both, therefore it is congruent. So you start with your given information, and then you can say that, hey, this side is the same in both. Why? Because of what we call the reflexive postulate. Some people call it reflexive property. But basically, the important term there is reflexive. That's going to be an important one as we go into triangle congruence proofs. So here is some practice. So they had given us that E is the midpoint of AB. Midpoint splits something into two congruent parts. So since E is the midpoint, we know that AE is congruent to EB. Again, you start with the given information, write your conclusion. You can write out the definition, This is the definition of a midpoint. Right? It is important that we know our vocabulary for this unit. Similarly, if BD bisects AC, we know that AD is congruent to DC. Write your given information, write your conclusion, give a reason. Again, we're using the definition of a bisector. Moving on to page 9. Diagonal AC bisects diagonal BD. So AC is cutting BD into two congruent halves. Start with your given information. Write your conclusion. DE is congruent to EB. Why? The definition of a bisector. Now we're given bisect, but we're bisecting an angle in this case. So we're not bisecting a segment, we're bisecting an angle. But the same theory applies. Because by BD bisects this whole angle, we know that these two pieces are the same. So based off of our given information, I can say that angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. Again, using our definition. Now, this symbol means perpendicular. You need to know this. Again, refer to the glossary if you need to review some of these basic vocabulary terms. Now, what do you know about perpendicular lines? They form a right angle. They had given it to you in this diagram. They do not have to give it to you in this diagram. It is important that you know what this symbol means. So, we start with our given information. Because of our given information, we know that there are two right angles, and because of the definition of perpendicular. Now, this is a set of angles we haven't talked about yet. This is, again, in our glossary. They're asking about angles 1 and angles 2. If you look, I drew two little guys, right? We have guy 1 and guy 2. If they're staring across, they will be able to see each other. Angles that are directly across from each other are vertical angles, and they have a special relationship because they are always going to be congruent. So vertical angles are across from one another, and they are always congruent. So, if we're given lines M and N to form these four angles, well, you have two pairs of vertical angles. Angles 1 and angles 2 are vertical, therefore they are congruent. Angles 3 and angles 4 are vertical, therefore they are congruent. Now we're going to basically write out what I just said in a two-column proof. We always start with our given information. I first stated that we have two pairs of vertical angles. How do I know that? Based off of the definition of vertical angles. They are across from one another. Because they are vertical angles, I know that both pairs are congruent. Angles 1 and 2 are congruent because they are vertical. Angles 3 and 4 are congruent because they are vertical as well. Now, just to summarize what we went through, some of the most important vocabulary. A midpoint creates two congruent segments. So when you have a midpoint, you can state that these two pieces are congruent. A bisector splits an angle or a segment into two congruent pieces. Perpendicular lines form right angles, and vertical angles are congruent. This is the basics that we are going to build off of as we move further into the unit